Eccoci qua, buonasera.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting entitled Which Tax Architecture for the European Union? Our guest needs no introduction in general and at the festival in particular. He attended the festival many times. It's worth reminding who he is. He is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, Professor Emeritus at the MIT in Boston. He used to be the Chief Economist. Till 2008, he was the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He was chairman of the Econometric Society, member of American Academy of Science, and past president of American Economic Association. He has written many books. An entire generation of economists trained by reading and studying his texts which are a pillar of research, in particular macroeconomics, which one of the most used texts in the universities of the 5 continents. Is the most advanced teaching approach of the mainstream economic theory. He also has been one of the main economists identifying some limitations and proposing some improvements to the approach. As chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, he admitted that sometimes institutions are not able to understand the severity of crisis. He proposed many changes to the mainstream economic theory with a clear objective of making traditional analysis less abstract and more consistent with the complexity of contemporary capitalism. 1 year ago, at the festival in Trento, remotely, he discussed with Tito Boeri about the recession and the tax instruments to be used at European level. Many things have occurred during this year. We know that there has been a major change of paradigm at the European Union with the Next Generation EU, the sharing of debt, the discontinuation of the Stability Pact, at least till the end of 2022. The pandemic has also changed another important paradigm which had settled in most advanced economies, i.e., that public intervention was doomed to leave the floor to the free markets. As a matter of fact, we have realized that the role of the state have been key, in particular in the field of vaccines, and a large part of the public opinion is in favor of giving more space to the role of the state in the economy. Spending means making debts. Mario Draghi often said that there is a good and a bad debt, the latter not producing growth. High indebted countries, and I quote Commissioner Gentiloni, should limit the growth of current expenditure. Now we are at the center of today's meeting. We are here to talk about the fiscal or tax rules for the European Union after the Stability Pact. It is clear that with a high level of indebtedness due to the pandemic, the rules of the past cannot be restored as they used to be. It is therefore necessary to adopt sustainability quality standards for debt, taking on board parameters like private saving, productivity, and that means making fiscal policy choices. There should be courageous choices so that we can go beyond the domestic competition within Europe we would be able to say that the union make us stronger, which is not yet the case. So the floor to Professor Olivier Blanchard. At the end of the lecture, we will be able to entertain some questions. Good evening. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share a few slides that I have. I hope you now see them. First, it's a great pleasure to participate in the Trento Festival. It is really one of my most loved conferences or discussions that I have every year. I'm very sad that I cannot be there in person, but hopefully next year I shall be. I decided to talk about the European fiscal rules. And why did I do this? Because on the one hand, it is an extremely technical and difficult issue. I would say even maybe a boring one, but it is one which has a major effect on our lives. Bad rules can have a terrible effect on the economy and by implication on us. And so I think it's very important to understand what is at stake. I'm going to proceed in 5 steps. And the first one is, why are there European Union rules in the first place? And why don't we just let governments do what they want? In most dimensions, governments are free to do exactly what they want. Why should there be an exception for fiscal rules? And I think that's a very fair question, because governments have very different mandates, objectives. Some want to help the poor more, some want to do it less, some want to build things, some want not to, and so on. But there is one dimension in which what one country does has potentially very big and catastrophic effects on other countries, which is that if it doesn't behave, if it starts spending too much, increasing debt, and markets start thinking that maybe it's going to default, that can have major effects on the financial system, on basically the holders of the debt, especially if there is default. If there is default of a state, then many of the banks which hold the bonds are going to be in trouble. If they are in trouble, then the banks which hold claims on these banks are going to be in trouble. And therefore that can be catastrophic. And therefore it's very important to make sure that basically no country misbehaving is taking risks which might lead to default. Now, this is not an abstract concern, it's a very real concern, and we saw it during the great financial crisis, and it came in the form of what's known as doom loops. What happened is that there were worries about default of public debt in some countries, including Italy, and that led investors to think, well, maybe the banks which are holding Italian debt or Greek debt, was a more extreme example, but even Italian debt, could be in trouble. And then they said, oh, but if the banks are in trouble, the state will have to intervene to help them. And therefore the state in turn might have to spend much more and be in trouble itself. Oh, but if the state is in trouble, then the banks are in trouble, and then there's a vicious circle, a doom loop. Fortunately, we didn't quite get there. We got close to it, but it shows that when a state looks like it could default, and even more so when it defaults, things can go very bad. So I think it's completely right to say that the European Union should have a structure in place so that it makes sure that the debt of every member is sustainable. It should stop there. It should not basically design the whole fiscal policy of countries. If a country is not taking any risks, then the way it collects taxes or the way it spends should be the privilege of a country and should reflect the democratic views of the people in that country. But making sure that that is sustainable is clearly one thing that the European Union should do. So let's go quickly through the history. It started with Maastricht, and it introduced very simple rules that you probably have all heard of, which is that the debt to GDP ratio should be 60%, and the maximum deficit that a country could run should be 3%. So two simple numbers, it looked great. And I think to defend this simple rule, one can say that when the euro was created, it was quite important that the rules be credible, and simplicity, these two numbers, were in that way a major plus. It made the rules very transparent. But the only problem is that the rules were much too simple, and states found that they really could not abide by them. And in particular, they did not allow for enough fiscal expansion when there was a recession. In a recession, you want to have a larger fiscal deficit to help demand, to help the economy recover. And the constraints that the rules were putting were too strong. An example of this, which many of you probably remember, is the excessive fiscal austerity that we saw in the Eurozone just at the end of a great financial crisis and at the beginning of what turned out to be the Euro crisis, so in 2010, 2011. And I think it can be said that there was too much fiscal austerity then, but it was a reflection of the rules that had been put in place. So over time, what happened is that the European Union realized that there were loopholes, that countries were not quite doing the right thing, that the rules were too simple, so they complexified the rules. They added more and more conditions that countries had to satisfy in order to avoid countries finding loopholes. And if you look at how the rules look today, it is a gigantic document, and I must be one of the few living people who actually have read all of it. And I can tell you that it is totally incomprehensible. That basically I do not see how any government can really understand what is allowed and what is not. So that's why there is this picture on the right, which is the cathedral of Avila, and it's the same idea. It started simple, and then they added stuff and stuff and stuff, and it's very hard to see the coherence of the building at the end. Now, that was one issue. The other issue is that the world changed in many ways since Maastricht. And in particular, what happened, many things happened, but the main change was that interest rates, both nominal rates, but real rates adjusted for inflation, steadily declined. From 1985, which was the peak, they have come down fairly steadily every year with few bumps, but really it's just, when you plot it, it is really just a downward trend. And it's clear that in that context, you know, how you think about that when interest rates are 10% or when interest rates are 0% is completely different. But the rules didn't change, did not accommodate this in any way, and therefore they became more and more off relative to what they should have done. So I think it's fair to say that although maybe at the beginning it forced some countries to be more responsible, it has been a mess. It has created more unemployment than was needed, and it just doesn't fit in many cases. It hasn't, as we know, there has been plenty of cheating. And here I didn't cite your country, but I cited two countries, which are France and Germany, which both did not respect the rules at various points in time. So clearly something has to be done. So what happened is that when the COVID crisis started at the beginning of last year, it was very clear that the countries could not basically satisfy the rules. It was clear that they needed to spend a whole lot for protection of people who had lost their jobs and for protection of firms which had lost sales. And therefore, they were going to spend much more than anything allowed by the rules. The rules had an escape clause, which said that when things are really exceptional, then the rules can be suspended. And they were suspended in early 2020, and they have been suspended until now. And I think the plan now is that they are going to be suspended until the end of the year. And you may have seen articles in the newspapers. There is now a strong push to have rules back in place by early 2023. A number of countries and a number of people are worried that in the absence of rules, countries are going to misbehave again, and therefore we have to go back to rules. Now, should it be the same rules? I think everybody agrees that it's not possible to go back to the old rules. I mean, if you look at the debt ratios, in most countries now, not most, but in many countries, the debt ratios are substantially above 100% of GDP. There is no way that countries can go to, the goal, in the Maastricht goal of 60% anytime soon. Reducing debt by 1 or 2% of GDP each year is very difficult to do. It has major effects on output. So going from 110 to 60 is something which is going to take many, many years if you try. So following the rules, if the same rules were put back in place, would require a fiscal consolidation, a fiscal contraction of an enormous magnitude, which would lead to a very large recession again. Why that? Well, there is one additional factor, which is that in normal times, or at least in the past, when you had a fiscal contraction, you could actually use monetary policy to undo some of it. So a fiscal contraction was decreasing demand, but you could decrease interest rates in order to offset. And by coordinating fiscal and money, you could actually limit the adverse effect on output. But we're not in that situation now, and we're not going to be there for quite a while, which is that the ECB cannot offset fiscal contractions. It's basically doing as much or maybe even more than what it can do. And there is no way it can, counteract a fiscal contraction. So it's clear that going back to the old rules is just a non-starter. So what needs to be done? Well, change the rules. And there are many proposals. And it's funny, they fall in two categories. The first one is, well, the rules are much too complex. So we have to simplify them, try to go back to some simple rule, 2 numbers, which will do the trick. It just has to be different numbers, but it's the same idea. That's going to fail exactly for the same reason as the initial rules failed, which is, this is a very complex issue. I'm going to discuss it in the next slide, but assessing that sustainability just cannot be reduced to 2 numbers. It's just going to go wrong. And then there are people saying, well, you complexify it more. So, but, we complexified, but not enough. And I can tell you that given the level of complexity there is today, if we complexified them even more, then, nobody would understand what's going on. So I think that I understand the desire to simplify. I understand the desire to make them more complex, but neither, I think, is going to do the trick. And so what I want to do now is just think about, okay, what is that sustainability? How can we actually measure that sustainability? And what I'm going to argue is that it depends on many factors, and so many factors in such complex ways that it's just too hard to capture in an arithmetic or a quantitative rule. So here I have to be a bit technical, but not much, which is I'm going to define what is known as the primary balance. The primary balance is the overall fiscal balance, but taking out interest payments. So primary balance typically looks better than the overall fiscal balance. It's basically what you have to pay interest, right? So the tentative definition of sustainability is the following. I've put it in blue to make it clear. That is sustainable if, with high probability, and I think we have to understand that sustainability is a probabilistic statement. It's nearly never sustainable with probability 1, maybe 0.99, but it's not. So with high probability, the government can generate a primary balance which is sufficient to cover interest payments. And if it does this, then it will keep the ratio of debt to GDP from exploding. It basically has to have enough of a primary balance to pay for the interest rates on the debt. For those of you who actually know the arithmetic behind this, I'm cheating a bit, but that's conceptually what you have to understand. Is the government going to be able to generate enough of a primary balance to cover what it has to pay in interest payments. Now, let me make one remark, which is, there was an article by Mr. Schauble in the Financial Times 2 days ago, which said, well, the governments will have to reimburse per date, and it's a lot of debt to reimburse. Indeed, if a government had to reimburse 100% of GDP, it would be in trouble. Now, there's a difference between you, me, and the government, which is the government doesn't have to reimburse for debt. Basically can keep a level of debt or debt to GDP ratio constant and just roll over, issue new debt when all debt comes due. We cannot do that. When we take a mortgage, we have to pay the interest on it, but at some point we actually have to pay back the mortgage. The government doesn't have to do this. The other relevant aspect is that the government can borrow at a much lower rate than you and I. And there are good reasons, which is that the government can basically tax people more. When we have a problem paying the mortgage, we don't have this option of, taxing people. So these are differences, and that's why the problem of the government is a bit different from the one that you and I have. Now, let me now go for the rest of the slide into what's needed to kind of take the two blue lines and make them operational. Okay, so you look at the country, what are going to be the factors which determine whether the debt is sustainable or not? Well, the first thing is clearly the interest rate, right? If the interest rate is very low, as it is now, and it's basically nearly zero in nominal terms, it's even negative in real terms, adjusted for inflation, then that looks good. And because interest payments are going to be very small. However, what matters here is not just the expected rate, but it's the range, right? It could be, and that's a very important aspect of how we have to think about things in the current environment, which, yes, the interest rates are roughly zero now, but maybe in 5 years, they could be 2%, or they could be minus 2% or 4%. So when you think about the future, you have to take into account this uncertainty. Uncertainty is really of the essence at this point. If I were sure that the interest rate was going to be zero or negative forever, it would be great, but I can't just assume that. Same thing for the growth rate, although there's probably less uncertainty about the range, but you have to think about the expected growth rate, potential growth rate, and then you have to think about the distribution. Then so this is going to determine how much you basically have to pay. What you have to pay is the primary balance. And here again, you're going to try to extrapolate, what the revenues are going to be, what the spending is going to be. You have to take into account what we call implicit liabilities, which is if you have a retirement system which has a large deficit, then sooner or later, basically you'll have to make up the difference from the budget. So your primary balance is going to look worse, right? So you have to take all these elements. You basically look at the distribution of outcomes, say 5 years out or 10 years out, and we have methods to do this. And you see what is the probability that we find ourselves with a primary balance which is not enough to cover the interest payments on the debt, in which case, an alarm bell just goes off, right? It's not going to happen with 100% probability, but suppose that the answer is with 15% probability, you're in trouble 5 years out. Then the question becomes, okay, so will the government be able to take measures to improve the primary balance sufficiently? So you found that you have to increase the primary balance by, say, 2% of GDP in order to decrease the probability of unsustainability. Okay, then you have to look at all kinds of factors again, which is if you need to have, say, a primary surplus of 2% of GDP, but you start in that situation with a primary deficit of 4% of GDP, this means you have to improve the primary balance by 6% of GDP. That's enormous. So the level of a primary deficit matters a whole lot. Then, the natural way of improving the primary balance is to cut spending or increase taxes. If the level of taxation is already very high, then you just don't have much room to increase it. So it's going to be even harder. Then we get to political dimensions, which are very relevant. The nature of a government matters. If it's a coalition government, it may be very hard to agree on a set of measures to improve the primary balance. If you're a single party, government, it's maybe easier. The nature of the prime minister matters. Markets felt much more relaxed about debt sustainability in Italy when Mario Draghi was named prime minister, right? The last point, which matters very much, is the maturity of the debt. Because suppose that the interest rate increases and the debt has very short maturity, it's basically 1 year debt, then your interest rate bill is going to increase very much this year. So you have to adjust very quickly. If you have a maturity of the debt, which is say 10 years, then most of your bonds are going to have a low interest rate. Only the new ones will have to have a high interest rate. So what you have to do, you have much more time to adjust. If you need to adjust the primary balance by say 4%, then you have 10 years to do it rather than 1 year. And clearly it's much easier. So all these factors matter when you actually want to assess whether a country has sustainable debt or not. And so as I said at the bottom, you could have a country which has 150% debt to GDP, and you look and you do this and you say it's fine, it knows what it's doing, I don't have to worry. The example of this is Japan, which has 170% net ratio of net debt to GDP, 250% gross debt to GDP. And at this stage, the interest rate on 10-year JGBs, which are the bonds issued by the Japanese government, is actually negative. So it's clear that the investors don't worry very much about default. But you could have a country where debt is 80% and worry because the government which came to power is some populist government which makes crazy statements, and you have a sense that they're going to run deficits and we really have to worry. So the point is, all these factors matter. So what do you do? So 2 more slides. So in this slide, I'm going to give you what I would call the Economist Solution, which is the solution that I would suggest, that I have suggested, but which is very much the point of view of an economist, not a policymaker. Okay. So the first point is to repeat what I just said, which is think of writing a rule ex ante, which would take all the elements on the previous slide into consideration. So just to take an example, how do you get, Mario Draghi as prime minister into a rule? I don't know how to do that, but I know that if Mario Draghi is prime minister, I relax a bit more, right? So it seems to me it's absolutely impossible to write a good rule. But this is not to say that nothing can be done. If I'm actually looking at Italy today, I can actually say, well, Mario Draghi is prime minister. The debt level is this, the deficit is that, the implicit liabilities are this, the distribution of interest rates and growth rates is this. So for a given country at a given time, I can basically do the exercise. I can think about the distribution of the interest rate R, the growth rate G, the primary balances. I do this year by year. I take into account the uncertainty, and then I can compute the probability that, I've taken 5 years or 10 years, that is on an exploding path. And if it looks like this probability is non-negligible, then, there is an issue of sustainability, right? So I think as an economist, I say, how should you proceed? You should basically have not a fiscal rule, but a fiscal standard. Basically, the fiscal standard should be the country should keep debt from exploding. It can be a bit more complex than that, but that's basically the goal. This is what you want to do. And then you'd say, well, let's see whether the country is doing the right job. You would basically do the analysis, which I've just described, that has a technical term, which is called the stochastic debt sustainability analysis, SDSA, okay, which is just a tool to do exactly what I've talked about. And basically, in each country, each year, you would basically do this and say, things are fine. I think if you did it at this point, things are probably fine. Okay, but you would not write down an ex ante, a before the fact rule, because you could not capture everything. So in a proposal that I've made with Jerome Zettelmeyer and Alvaro Leandro, 2 co-authors, I've basically argued for doing this. And the way we describe how it could be done is that you would have the EU Commission, maybe 10 or 15 members, 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 10 or 15 in parallel with the domestic fiscal council, basically do this exercise, do this SDSA exercise, explain what assumptions they are using and so on, and then come to a conclusion saying, well, yes, maybe there is a risk and we would like the government to actually do something. Then the government would be asked, if this was the case. I mean, in most cases, I think, they would get a pass at this point because the interest rates are so low and the uncertainty about interest rates is relatively limited over the next 5 years, I think. But if a government didn't pass, then it would be asked to present measures that it intends to take in order to reduce the risk. I'm going to increase the VAT, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It's clear that the government will, in general, disagree with the work of a commission or even the work of its domestic fiscal council, say, well, you haven't been optimistic enough, you've been too pessimistic about growth, you've been too pessimistic about interest rates. There will be a discussion. There could be agreement or there could be no agreement. If there is disagreement, then the decision would go to either the European Council, which is the way it has happened until now. When there was a disagreement, the European Council was in charge of deciding. Or if you wanted to build some jurisprudence and some expertise, you could basically extend the Court of Justice to have more economic knowledge. At this stage, it's not ready to do it, but it could do it. And it would take a decision. It would be a judicial decision. And that's probably an issue from the point of view of democracy. But this happens in many cases for antitrust and many other dimensions of what Brussels does. So my sense is, if I were a benevolent dictator and I was in Brussels, this is what I would try to do. It's probably not what's going to happen, and that's my last slide, which is that what I have found is when I push this idea of a fiscal standard rather than fiscal rules and the use of this tool, SDSA, people say, oh, it's too fuzzy, too many assumptions, we're never going to converge, and countries are basically going to cheat, and we're not going to be able to constrain them. I'm not sure, but I hear it, and I'm not the policymaker, and I suspect that at the end, the European Union is going to go for modified rules, but rules. It's going to want to have something. I suspect, for example, that a number which is now utterly irrelevant will stay. The 60% debt ratio will remain. It will be symbolic. Countries will not be asked to actually attain it at any point, but it will remain there because symbolically it's very important. So the challenge this year, given that the rule has to be basically ready in 7 months, is to hope for a rule which will do a decent job. A decent job in the sense of, in most cases, basically doing the same thing as the essay which I've presented on the previous slide would be. I think at the minimum, what they have to do is take into account the level of the interest rate. And we are in a world in which the interest rates are extremely low. And that's not because of COVID, that's not because of a great financial crisis. It's a long trend, and they are going to remain very low. When interest rates are low, borrowing is much less dangerous. And if 60% had at any point been the right number, it is now a much higher number. Japan shows that you can go much higher because what really matters is debt service, right? It's the product of debt times the interest rate. So this has to be recognized. A set of rules which did not recognize that, I think, would just be a non-starter. The second is that it should give enough room for countries to use fiscal policy to stabilize output. And the reason, again, is that we are going to be in an environment in which monetary policy is going to be constrained for quite a while. This is the so-called zero lower bound constraint. At this stage, monetary policy cannot do a lot. It can do something to tighten, but it cannot be much to loosen. And therefore, fiscal policy has to stabilize output. And if the rules prevent fiscal policy from doing this, then you'll get high unemployment, cyclical unemployment in various countries. And I don't want to see this happen. The last point I would make is that these rules have to allow for the right level of public investment. Because what happened in the past is that when a country had to consolidate, to reduce spending, what it did is the easiest thing to do, which is to cut public investment. because public investment you can cut, and this year it doesn't look, it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic in many years, but you're not going to be there anymore. So it basically has to protect public investment. Now, is there a way to write a rule which is going to be a half-decent approximation to what should be done? I think that's the challenge. And if any of you are working on these issues, I think that's a challenge that we all have. Find a rule which is not going to be perfect, but is going to be much better than what we have, flexible enough, but tough enough. And the stakes are very high. If the European Commission screws things again, then the effects on output and unemployment on Italy are going to be very substantial. So let me stop here and take questions if there are any.
Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Blanchard, for your lecture. We'll see if there are questions for Professor Blanchard. There's a mic available for you if you wish to ask a question to Professor Blanchard. We still have 15 minutes to go, so you can very well take advantage to take at least 3-4 questions from the audience. Is there a request for the floor? Can you please come here and use the microphone?
Può usare quel microfono.
There's a mic available for you. I'm not an expert on economics. I haven't studied economics. But I would like to make a comment, though. Anyway. I have a question in that I understand that debt has to be reduced. But I think that money should be found where it is. There are huge inequalities in our country. I come from a village where Mr. Ferrero lives, and I know it is a family business that was turned into a multinational. So there's a lot of people that are very well off. Ferrero became a multinational. It piled up a lot of profits. Hence, I believe that no redistribution of wealth has been achieved. There was no redistribution among the workers at that factory. I see them all. Certainly, they enjoy job security according to the collective bargaining. They work a lot, and yet they do not get any of the profit that the company gets. So the managers pile up huge gains, and this leads to the increase in inequalities. So I think that higher taxes should be levied against those who gain more. Even at a time of crisis, people piled up huge wealth, and I think that they should be taxed. They should pay higher taxes. Maybe we can take a couple of questions more and then give the floor back to Professor Blanchard. Any more questions? I would like to ask a question myself, if I may. Professor Blanchard, you quoted Schäuble, Mr. Schäuble, and reading the lively conversation that you had on Twitter with reference to the statements by Schäuble, who said that he was concerned about the potential deflation following suit to the expansionary measures. Can you perhaps dwell on that tweet of yours? So as to explain also to the layman what are the different stances. Let's see if there's any more questions from the floor. No more questions from the floor, then perhaps we can invite Professor Blanchard to take these two questions. Actually, that Professor Boeri who asks for the floor.
These are things that are tricky and all of this. The other day, in a conversation with Commissioner Gentiloni, we raised this issue of a revision of the rules. And I asked him about fiscal standards and your idea. And he didn't seem to be against this. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh. Should I repeat then from the start? No, first of all, wonderful lecture, very clear. And these are difficult issues, so thank you so much. The other day, talking to Commissioner Gentiloni about the reform of the fiscal rules, he acknowledged that this is badly needed. And also, we were mentioning the idea of a fiscal standards that you were supporting. And the reaction he had was not negative in principle, but simply thought that it's very difficult to go through a reform of the treaties. So if you have to change the treaties, that is going to be something that will prevent these changes to be done. So I wonder whether there is any possibility to reform in the direction that you are proposing without having to change the treaties.
Grazie, Tito Boeri.
Thank you also to Professor Boeri. So over to you, Professor Blanchard. You have the floor to take these three questions.
Sure, let me take them in the order in which they came. So I completely agree that there is a major issue of inequality in many countries. And indeed, it got worse during the COVID crisis and still worse. Part of the reason is that the way we have fought the COVID crisis is by having very low interest rates. And basically what low interest rates do is that they increase the price of assets, they increase the price of stocks, they increase the price of houses. So people who have stocks, the people who have houses, do much better than the poor people who don't have those assets. So I think COVID has indeed increased inequality, and I think that there is a reasonable argument for having a one-time COVID levy, if you want, tax on the capital gains due to COVID. I would be in favor of it, and many economists are in favor of it. That's not going to solve the problem of inequality. In general, there are issues long before COVID, and they will still be there after COVID, which is that we have a hard time taxing capital. Because capital is very mobile and capital is very smart, and it goes to places where the rate of taxation is low, and as a result, it doesn't pay much in the way of taxes. Fortunately, there is actually progress, as some of you may know. There has been negotiations at the Oecd, which have been going on for a long time. But the US has just indicated that it is quite eager to actually do something. And the idea would be to tax multinationals in better ways, in more efficient ways, and basically eliminate the possibility that they create their headquarters in some tax haven. So I completely agree. Now, the point where we might disagree is that I'm not sure that we need to reduce the debt right now. But whether or not we do, I think the idea of having some redistribution from the people who have benefited from the COVID crisis towards the people who have suffered from the COVID crisis is something that government should indeed look at. I completely agree. On my discussions on the second question, my discussion with Mr. Schauble. It's a long-running discussion. Mr. Schauble is very much in the old mode of debt is bad and don't complicate my life in explaining that's more complicated than that. That is bad and therefore we have to reduce that. And I have a sense that there is no argument that could actually make him change his mind. Now, the reason this came up is that he actually wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times in which he said that is bad, and Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard actually agree with me. And I felt that I had to be clear about the fact that we did not agree. I've disagreed with Biden stimulus program, which is this enormous program, 1.9 trillion, which is going to increase demand, and I think it's going to overheat the US economy in ways which are not particularly desirable. But I have objected to it because it's too big and because it's not needed. I have not objected to it because it increases debt. I think that if it was smaller and financed by debt, I'd be completely happy. And then I've indicated that I'm worried about inflation in the United States for the same reason, because this enormous increase in demand facing limited supply is likely to lead to quite a bit of inflation. And although I would like to have more inflation than what we have, I don't want to have 10% inflation. That would scare me. Mr. Schauble has said that I worried about inflation in Europe, but I want to reassure him I don't, because in Europe, the plans are much smaller than the Biden plans. We're much further away from full employment. So I think the risk of inflation in Europe is very, very small. So I wanted to be clear. On Tito Boeri's remark, yes, first at some general level, if you're going to get a terrible rule because you don't want to change a treaty, then you actually have to think twice about whether this is the right thing to do. But maybe more realistically, it seems to me, and we have written this, and I don't want to go into the legal details, but we think that what we have proposed can actually be done without a treaty change. It is for lawyers to decide, but my sense is if the Commission decided that this was the way to go, they have good lawyers and they could make the case, and there would not be a need for treaty change. But again, the notion that a treaty is preventing you from doing something which is clearly better must lead you to say, should we revisit the treaty? Although I realize it's complicated.
Thank you very much, Professor Blanchard. We hope that next year we'll meet in person.
Yes.
This year it's 50-50. Some of us are here, some of us are elsewhere. So I think that we should put our hands together to thank you,
Thank you
most warmly for your lecture. Thank you, Professor Blanchard.